A warm and enthusiastic welcome to a change maker and someone who's truly transforming lives, Elizabeth Funk. You got it.
Such an honor to be here today. You know, when I look back on the humanitarian crises in our history, slavery, the Holocaust, genocides, I always think, how did ordinary people get up in the morning and just walk to work and think, oh well. You know, we get up every morning and walk to work past tents, people sleeping under cardboard, their feet infected with cuts and wounds, butt cracks sticking out, that seems to always be a thing. And we just think, oh well, gosh, that's the way it is. You know, back in Hitler's time, you would have been assassinated if you spoke up. What's our excuse? Really? I hope our grandkids look at us in horror. People slept where? Why? How do you let that happen? I didn't have an answer. I think I do now, at least to the why. Let me take you back, my journey. I graduated from Stanford as an economics major, and I ended up at Microsoft because it was right when Windows came out and the first versions of consumer software. And Microsoft correctly learned the hard way that when techies design products, only techies know how to use them. So they hired non-techies to design their software. And I found myself on Microsoft Word, and I was assigned the little vertical market of the legal market, which is they're heavy word processing users. And I'll never forget doing a sales call with a woman who ran the word processing department at a big law firm, and I'm showing her this beautiful screen with bold words and colors, because she's used to black screen with white text. And she kept going, but how do I know it's bold? There's supposed to be a bold on code and then the word and bold off code. And I remember looking at her going, because it looks bold. Like, what do you mean, how do you know? I had to go back and we created a feature in Word called reveal codes. If you did function F, you could see the darn codes because people couldn't get out of the old mindset. After Harvard Business School, I went to Yahoo, this little company with literally 10 people crammed into one room. We didn't even have a sign on the door. My mother was horrified that she paid for business school for me to go to a company with an exclamation point at the end of its name. That did not go over well. She kept getting it confused with Yoo-hoo, the chocolate drink. But it was one of these times where we were redefining the world's culture. And we were even set in that old mindset of people define community by their zip code. Well, now all of a sudden we're seeing people don't define community by a zip code. They define it by a shared love of Beanie Babies, of all things. And, you know, the mindset, the shifting of thinking and clinging to those old assumptions, it's hard to shake. After Yahoo, I left when it was about 3,000 people. I don't do 3,000 people. I'm much more of an innovator than that. And I was starting to look for my next startup tech company. But I had some wealth. I was there during the IPO and thought I needed to give back in some way. And I remember thinking, what is it I care about? And there was sort of this hollow moment where it's like, all my friends care about the opera or whatever. I don't know what. And that was even worse. So I started looking harder, and I was introduced to the concept of microfinance. Small loans to help the world's poor build their own way out of poverty. And I was smitten. I went on a trip to India, and I met a mother. She was a single mother with 3 kids and a cow. And she sold that milk, but she never made enough to have food for all of them. And she said every night I had to pick which child I was going to look in their eye and say, sorry, honey, not tonight. And I still get teary because I was a young mother with young kids, and I know what it feels like when your kid's hungry at the park and you're 3 blocks away. I couldn't believe it, and she said she'd been saving all her pennies to buy poison and put them out of their misery together when she was introduced to a bank that lent her $400. And with that $400, she bought a thermometer and pasteurized her milk into cheese, far more profitable. By the time I met her, her kids were all biking to the next village after school selling cheese. That had saved her life. It was amazing to me. So I came back, and I got more involved, and I was introduced to Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, and potentially join his board. So I attended a board meeting in upstate New York, and I'm looking at their finances. I'm like, wait a minute, you guys are profitable. And your bigger branches have economies of scale and can charge a lower interest rate. Why aren't you taking investment dollars? Muhammad Yunus yelled at me in front of the whole board. It's unethical to make money while doing good. Steve Rockefeller pulled me aside at the break and said, don't worry about the ethics, it's just not possible. Well, you don't tell me that. I was not back to JFK Airport before I'd called a friend and said, let's do this. We created a little $8 million fund called the Dignity Fund that lent money, debt, not equity, so there wouldn't be perverse incentives, to 14 microfinance organizations globally. 2 of them went public. It scaled. And the headlines, horror, investors make $1.2 billion off of the poor, shameful. Well, you know what? Microfinance today, the vast majority of the money in microfinance is investment capital. And microfinance is largely credited for having eradicated what the UN calls extreme poverty. If investors made a profit as a byproduct, I'm good with my ethics. But we're so stuck in our thinking that you're supposed to make all your money and give it away. Why? Who says? Those are old-fashioned paradigms. And today, impact investing is a big movement. And I spent 18 years of my life running impact investment funds, preaching that if the world's problems are going to get solved, you need the scale of the capitalist system, which is why it's especially ironic I started a nonprofit. My friends looked at you? Like, who are you and what did you do with Elizabeth? A nonprofit? Although I do stand corrected because I think philanthropy plays an important role in de-risking new solutions. And this is a new solution. So fast forward 18 years, I'd been running all these impact funds. I was getting a little bored. And the pandemic hit. I'm a member of a group called Young Presidents Organization, YPO. Andy is as well. A bunch of leaders of companies at young ages. And we had a session scheduled in May 2020 about homelessness that was canceled because of the pandemic. Somebody had the smart idea to send out a note to all the registrants and say, anybody want to form a study group? Let's learn about this. Sure, it was bored. We were bored, first couple weeks of the pandemic, thought it was going to be short. And we met every week and we started just asking questions. We didn't know anything about this problem, but we knew one thing. We kept spending more and more money and the problem kept getting worse. There's something wrong. So we, in a little bit of arrogance, applied our business thinking and looked at it like a business case and started researching and understanding. During those couple of months, I did 350 30-minute Zoom calls, just learning. I became fascinated. I logged them. And the more I started learning, oh my God, this is solvable. We're just looking at it like a black screen with white text. This is solvable. And when I say this, I mean unsheltered homelessness. I'm not going to claim that the housing crisis is easy to solve. But to get somebody indoors, with all due respect, we have sent men to the moon and decoded the human genome. 4 walls and a roof? I don't want to disrespect the importance and the complexity of what you guys do, but it is 4 walls and a roof. We are thinking about this wrong. What's our problem? We got to look at ourselves. So I started looking at it harder, and there were 3 aha discoveries that after I really saw this clearly, I'll never forget sitting on a sofa with a friend going, God, I'm going to have to do this. It's just going to kill me because it's so obvious. And as much as I care about homelessness, this could have been dolphins or puppies. It was, for me, an obvious solution that we were just missing because we were stuck in black screens with white text thinking. So what were those things? The first one is we do have huge budgets that we put towards homelessness, and they all go towards building permanent housing. Why? Because permanent housing ends homelessness. When you come from the streets into something temporary, you're still homeless. You're just classified as sheltered homeless. But we got to end homelessness. That means permanent housing. The problem with that is that across California, the average cost to build a single unit of permanent housing, $800,000. In our big cities like San Francisco and LA, where we need it most, it's over $1 million per unit. The result, and of course it takes a long time, and the neighbors push back, and just can't do it. The result is for every 1 person who exits the system to permanent housing, 4 are falling into homelessness in San Francisco. You don't have to have a calculator to know that does not work, right? So the second thing I learned is that our misconception about the people on the streets is really a misconception, or at least the causality is. When people first become homeless, 17%, 1-7, have a serious mental or behavioral health issue that prevented them from retaining independent housing. 4 weeks later, that's doubled. The average wait time in San Francisco for permanent housing is 14 years. Of course, everybody on the streets is mentally ill and addicted to drugs for survival. Of course they are. But we let that happen because we're clinging to the belief that only permanent housing is a valid solution. Are we kidding ourselves? Look at what's happening, the devastation to these people. I have one of the residents at our 33 Golf project was a woman who was in an ugly domestic violence relationship, and she escaped, and she didn't even try to go to a shelter. She knew they were all full. Wouldn't have done it anyway. Women are 3 times as likely to be sexually assaulted in a group shelter than they are on the streets. But she was terrified to fall asleep. So she bought some crappy coffee and tried to stay awake, and she drifted off anyway. The next morning, she got up and she went to the Tenderloin and started asking around, where can I find this thing they call meth? Because she knew it would be safer than letting herself sleep. Conscious decision. By the time she got to 33 Golf, when I met her, she came running over with her 30-day Narcotics Anonymous chip. She'd gotten connected to a doctor who prescribed methadone to help with the cravings. She was doing her best, but it was going to be a hard battle. And she said to me, if I'd had a safe place to go, none of this would have happened. But she had to. So we got to let go of the blame that these people are choosing this. I'll tell you, they choose it over what they're offered, a bunk bed in a big group shelter. Of course people don't want that, right? But we got to look harder at the realities of these people as humans. Nobody prefers a cement pillow. I've never met one that does. They prefer it to what we're offering because we haven't stopped and thought about them as humans. So the third thing that I learned, which is, the math, the economics in me, is that the cost of letting people languish on the streets, $80,000 per person per year. Emergency room visits, encampment sweeps, police interactions, jail. I even know Ben, who had figured out what crime you commit in the fall so you can be inside and warm during the winter and be out in spring. You know what that costs? That's expensive. But the problem is $80,000 is scattered across so many budgets that you don't see it, right? All these different stakeholders. And that doesn't count the lost tax revenue and the convention revenue and all those things we think about, but just the hard costs. When you get somebody into interim housing, like we'll talk about, if you smother them with supportive services, case managers, 3 meals a day, $40,000. It's half. And yet the problem is that's paid for by one budget, the homelessness department, who is scored on reducing homelessness, which is permanent housing. Well, with all due respect, those may be their metrics. They're not mine. So we set out to think, what is possible between a tent and a permanent housing, right? Why are we so obsessed with this permanent housing thing? Because nothing in life is permanent. Nothing, especially for this population. Why are we so focused on permanent housing? Well, one reason is because it's funded by the federal government, Section 8 vouchers. But when you're in interim housing or shelter, it's paid for by the city. The second reason, of course, being these metrics of the departments being scored on reducing homelessness. So the net result is that a city would rather get one person into a $1 million apartment than 30 into interim housing because their metrics don't change and they don't have to pay for it. That's wrong. That's just wrong. Those might be their metrics. They're not ours. I want to focus on reducing the suffering on our streets. And when somebody gets indoors, I quite frankly don't care how long they get to stay. Why do we care? We've got to let go of our old definitions and our old beliefs about what is appropriate. So we set out to reimagine shelter. And this problem affects us all. This is an all-hands-on-deck solution. There is no more sitting around and saying, well, the government's not solving it, and shame on our government. There's so much energy out there complaining. Why aren't we directing that to saying, all right, if the government's not going to think about this right, the private sector will. We aren't measured and scored and funded by all those things. We're just going to do it. So we pulled together a whole group of people and started thinking, all right, we're going to start talking about ending this problem, not just making it better or whatever. So we started looking at what other factors are here that are holding us back. First one, number one, people don't want to go to a group shelter, right? Who would want to sleep on a bunk bed with strangers, right? Nobody wants them. So cities use the excuse, we don't build shelters, nobody will use them. Well, what about asking the customer, right? Number 1, 2, and 3 reasons that they turn it down is they want their own space. They're worried about their stuff getting stolen. They want to bring their pet. All of that is solved if you have your own room. So people are going to have their own room. There's that. Land is expensive, especially in California. But you drive down the street, there's a lot of vacant land out there. Somebody's got a project tied up in entitlements. We're holding it for when high-speed rail comes. That's funny, right? So it sits there vacant in the meantime. Well, unused land is a wasted resource. So let's make these relocatable. Let's borrow land, right? This is a picture of the parking lots that we used for San Francisco. It's an old City College building. The developers got plans for a mixed-use project. That's not going to be soon. So they're sitting there vacant. So the third reason is building codes are onerous. Wow, we have made it expensive to build housing in California. But this is a crisis. And the California state has written what they consider to be adequate safety measures that are for crisis. Well, if a city has declared a housing crisis, which everybody has in California, that allows us to waive all those excess rules and just focus on basic life safety. The municipality shall waive all local rules and ordinances that strict adherence would in any way hinder, delay, or impede their ability to deal with the crisis. Waive everything. The problem is it doesn't spell out what it ought to be, it just says waive it. Well, that's when Gensler comes in, because you've got city people looking at this permit set and looking at what their real building codes are and saying they don't match. They don't match. We don't have to live to your building codes. But you have to talk them into it. We do not have to focus on the ratio of electric vehicle chargers to parking spaces. Not kidding, that was a long negotiation with the city of Mountain View. So the other reason that we don't have shelters is because people don't want them in their backyard, right? And why would you? You got people coming, standing in line, they have to be out the next morning. They don't want shelters in their neighborhoods. But if you invite in the people sleeping in the immediate area, and then you enforce, you say, I've offered everybody a dignified shelter option, you can't sleep here if you don't take it, that neighborhood sees the visible and measurable difference. When we were going before City Council in San Jose recently to approve our next project, the only people who showed up in opposition are people who were pissed it wasn't in their neighborhood. That's what we need. This project in Santa Barbara is right next door to Morgan Stanley's private client services. You know how well that went over? But the first people offered in were the people who were sleeping in the parking lot of Morgan Stanley. The next people were in the alley behind. Right? All of a sudden, that downtown neighborhood merchants association is saying this is the best darn thing that's ever happened to us. Right? We just have to rethink it differently. So this is what we do. We use relocatable, mass-produced panels or manufactured housing. We don't care. We pick, and we put them on vacant land. People get to stay a while, and they have their own room with their own door, and they have case managers who work with them with the assumption that you're going to get back on your feet if there's any chance that you can. Because the problem with today's system is when you fall into homelessness, you're going to be on the streets a while. I can tell you, by the time you finally get that permanent housing, we're going to have to take care of you the rest of your life, right? It's all welfare, right? But if you can get people indoors quickly into something decent, you know, now they've still got a chance. But what we do is not housing. It's HUD's definition of housing. HUD's definition of housing is separate sleeping quarters and your habitual place of residence. But somehow this isn't considered housing. To who? And by the way, it's about the size of my son's dorm room in college, and the tuition bill says housing. He doesn't have his own bathroom and kitchen. Why are we clinging to black screens and white text in our definition of housing? Well, we just don't. We're not taking it. So here's our San Francisco project. It was 2 parking lots. They had 44 tents. It was a safe sleeping, sanctioned encampment. We moved them over. We put up 70 cabins in 4 weeks. Like, why is this so hard? We've got 92 people sleeping there. We've got 8 dogs, because you can bring your dog, right? You can bring your pets. In normal shelters, you can bring a pet, but they keep them in a kennel. Nobody's doing that, right? And what about privacy with your partner? Have we forgotten that these are humans? We don't get in your bunk bed with your partner. Are we kidding? We got to think about this from the dignity and the reality of people. And it was the most beautiful experiment. You can see the Gensler people are painting murals. Everybody came and did what they could. We had an 8th grade class who adopted the rooms and brought the bedding and welcome notes and decorated and made it like home. I had an old woman who hand sewed pillows for everybody. Everybody out there is looking for a way to help, and they don't know how, so they complain. Well, the time to do that is over. We've got to get serious about solving this. The communities are built beautifully. That's when Gensler comes in. It's important that it's trauma-informed and that it is built in a way that it really fosters community. It's an ironic thing. It's quite a challenge, which is that people won't go to a group shelter because they want privacy, and yet they learned in the encampments that community is literally survival. You've got to have your friends. How do you design for something that maximizes the safety and feeling of community and yet also the privacy that people need? Only the best in the world can figure that out. Santa Barbara, this one was right next door to Morgan Stanley, as I said, but we literally consulted with the Historic Society to make sure the shape of the arch was appropriate and the color of the tile roofs were appropriate. They weren't tile, but they matched the tile colors. And a beautiful exterior that literally matched Morgan Stanley. It was a little parking lot, 35 parking spaces, right? Better use. Well, it started to take off. I'm proud to say we walked every mayor we could find through this. Like, show it off, and jaws drop. They're like, wait, what? Costs $32,000 per room. And that includes the bathroom buildings, the case manager offices, the computer lab, the whole project. $32,000 in 4 weeks. Seriously. So it started to become popular. You can see all the list of places, Roanoke Park, Alameda, San Luis Obispo, Ojai, sprouting up everywhere because it just makes sense. Now, of course, there's still the funding and metrics problem. But I'm starting to see, in this day and age, you can't get around anything without thinking about politics and Trump. But, the thing that's standing in our way, are the things that are super solvable. If you're scoring your department on the wrong metric, you change the metric, right? If you've got Section 8 vouchers that only go to permanent housing, then you change that. Those can be solved with the stroke of a pen. I literally looked at Secretary Fudge, former HUD secretary. I said, unsheltered homelessness could be ended with the stroke of one pen, and you're holding it. It could be. Those are easy things to solve. It wouldn't be easy if everybody had different points of view, but if you think about it, the conservatives who want small budgets, this is fiscally responsible to get everybody into a little cabin where we don't have to clean up after them on the streets and where they have a chance of returning to be a taxpayer. For the humane, this is way more humane than allowing people to suffer on the streets. And then there's the regular people who, as taxpayers, they don't want to say it, but they kind of feel like they have a right to clean parks and clean sidewalks. All of the political views align on ending unsheltered homelessness, and fast. The only thing that's not at that intersection is current policy and funding. Well, we're a little arrogant, but we don't care. We're going to do it anyway. And look at that growth curve. Those are actuals. So now you fast forward, and we're building all these cute communities, and they're popular, but we're not going to solve this problem chipping away at it 30 rooms at a time. The Santa Barbara project, one of the county supervisors took me to lunch, and he said, "This is amazing. I want one in my district." I looked at him and I said, "No, we're going to do the whole county or not at all. Let's end this problem in your county instead of just talking about it." So all the supervisors went into a closed-door session, and they all came out with one site in their district. Everybody's doing their part. So we are building enough for everyone unsheltered in the county of Santa Barbara. You got to imagine Ventura County's calling, going, "What's going on over there?" And you know what happens when you start talking about ending a problem? The philanthropy shows up. The community shows up. All of a sudden, there's optimism. In fact, I think the single thing standing in our way of solving this problem is people don't believe it's solvable. Yes, it is. You count the number of people, you multiply it by a cost, and there is a finish line. Don't tell me it's not solvable. It's solvable. Unsheltered homelessness. And I realize that when you get everybody indoors, there's still a lot of work to do to deal with the housing crisis and have enough beds for everyone. But our streets can't be the waiting room, right? So we're starting to talk now about a concept called functional zero, which is, a geeky, analytical, my economics major comes in, but you look at how many people are unsheltered, you multiply it by a discount rate because the way things turn over, and you announce this is the finish line and we're going to go for it. Mayor Mahan in San Jose has done that. He said, look, city can't do it alone, but at least we're going to name the problem. They spent a couple months and came back and said, we need 2,600 additional rooms, which is going to cost us $255 million. There's the finish line. And I, as mayor, stand behind it. We will end this problem. They changed one of their bond measures that was tricky politically, that was supposed to go towards housing, and got permission to use 90% of it for interim housing. So the city's putting in everything they can into the kitty. Now they can go to the county and say, here's our gap. They can go to philanthropy and say, here's our gap. But if the political leader stands firm and says, because we are going to end it, not make it better, all of a sudden, all the stakeholders have something to come together for. San Jose's doing it. San Francisco, Mayor Lurie, I had the honor of helping him write his homelessness plan. And again, number of people on the streets, multiply it by, it's about 0.6 is what the analysis says. 2,500 additional placements is what they need. His home run plan says, I commit to build 2,500 additional placements and end unsheltered homelessness during my term. That's the kind of talk that we need. And Santa Barbara County, by the way, most of the construction cost was paid for by philanthropy. Almost all of it. People are racing to be part of the solution if they actually believed it would end. And in Santa Barbara County, we're more than halfway there. And the North County is going to reach functional zero by the end of this year. You know, it seems so obvious. Oh, get everybody indoors. You have no idea how controversial this is. The head of the Coalition for Homelessness in San Francisco sat me down. She said, I'm going to be clear with you. Your success is my worst nightmare. And I will do everything I can to make sure you don't succeed at this. That's the status quo thinking out there. And the more this interim housing starts to catch on, the more people get scared and get upset about it. And she's got a reasonable reason. She says, you know, when the city gets everybody in, there's no more feces and needles on the street. The city will think they're done. And they're going to leave everybody in these little substandard cabins and not build the permanent housing we need. When I was at Stanford, I was there for the earthquake, and we had temporary classroom trailers that were there on my 20th reunion. I get the concern. Wouldn't that be a good problem to have? And by the way, instead of spending $80,000 cleaning up after everybody, we're spending $40,000. We got a lot left over to deploy in more constructive ways than having public works out there cleaning up feces, right? We're just not thinking about it right. And what gives me the optimism is that this problem, everybody wants, for different reasons, wants to end unsheltered homelessness, and it costs half as much to do it. The only thing missing is spreading this word. And that's why I'm here. We've got to stick together and say, gosh darn it, I don't want a black screen with white text. Let's do this right. Let's get everybody indoors. And, you know, the thing that's sort of subtle that I didn't understand right away is that when people first become homeless, they go register, and they get assessed, and they get scored a vulnerability score. And that vulnerability score is what gives you priority for housing. And so if you're newly homeless and you've still got your wits about you, you're out of luck. And it's kind of like the pandemic when we had a shortage of respirators, and we had to go through the moral conundrum of, do you give them to the elderly who are likely to die anyway, or do you give them to the young people who might survive? And remember all those issues and battering around on CNN and whatever. And that's kind of what we've got here. Of course we have to give it to the most vulnerable or the guy that's been on the waiting list the longest. But the guy who came home yesterday, that person still has potential. That human potential that we're allowing to rot because they have to wait until they don't have their wits about them. That's broken. Somebody was told, go get AIDS and come back and I can bump you up a few years. And by the way, the vulnerability score is increased by number of police interactions, number of emergency room visits, some perverse incentives there, right? The only way to get around that moral conundrum is to have enough for everybody. Then you've got the luxury of also offering a spot to the person who's newly homeless. And you start with the assumption that we're going to get them back on their feet. If they have a place to plug in their phone, take a shower, show up to work on time, that human potential, we need to capture it. And with all due respect, the person who's been on the streets for 14 years, it's palliative care. And we as society owe it to them. But what we owe ourselves is to prevent someone who has had an unfortunate experience from converting into what we call chronic homelessness, which is a ward of the state for the rest of their lives. That is not acceptable. We can't prevent homelessness, but gosh darn it, as a society, we can prevent it from becoming a chronic problem. And the only way to do that is to have a safe place where people can come, take a deep breath. My dad said I should have named this organization A Deep Breath, because that's what it is, right? It's basic. It's a tiny little room. You got to share bathrooms. Who cares? Who cares? The residents don't. In fact, one of the problems we have now is people don't want to leave. They finally clear the waiting list, 14 years. No, I'm fine here. Seriously, one of the guys said, crying, hugged me, said, you're going to have to put me on suicide watch. I don't have that much stuff. I don't cook. I don't need that. I need my peeps. But our society has defined housing as that guy having a high-rise apartment with a granite countertop. And if he stayed in interim housing, that's a failure of the system. We've got to make him go. Why? Why is that our definition of success and our definition of housing? Like, other cultures have community living as a culturally acceptable norm. Somehow in America, that's not acceptable. We think our version of the American dream is that everybody's got their own apartment. Did we ask them? We've got to challenge ourselves to rethink this. Together, we can end unsheltered homelessness. And it really is all hands on deck. And I don't want to understate how much of a lift this is to change the status quo thinking. It is deeply ingrained. It takes brands like yours with the credibility that can sit down with that building department official and explain why we don't need to have fire sprinklers, 64 square feet. But you know, the fire marshal will tell you, you're not going to convince me to treat these people's life safety with any less regard than everyone else's. The only problem is, he signs off on this building permit. He doesn't sign off on the encampment, where people's lives are 10 times more at risk for lighting bonfires at night to stay warm and to cook, right? We need to help them make the collective decision, the right decision collectively. But that's optimism, because those departments all make their decisions based on their liability concerns. They weren't elected about ending homelessness. They're just worried they'll lose their job if one of these units lights on fire, right? And the mayors typically don't have the authority to tell the building departments, or certainly the fire marshal, to overrule that thinking. That's a real challenge. And you guys have been great partners in helping us think about how to explain that, how to do this more at scale, because we've got to do this faster and more cost effectively. When we did our project at 33 Goff, the project total was about $34,000 per unit. Most of our projects we're doing now are over $100,000. Building codes haven't changed. Laws haven't changed, but we've gotten out of the crisis mentality, and we're starting to let building departments push a little more. We got to trench the utilities. Why? So our collective role is to keep pushing back and remind them that this is a crisis. We've got to treat it with the crisis mentality that's going to allow us to solve this. And I think we're doing that. Really proud to be scaling this together. We're still getting into optimizing so that we can get, my goal is rinse and repeat. Every time we do one of these projects, we spend a month deciding which modular vendor is going to. We got to stop all that. We got to keep improving and get to where we can really, one region at a time, end this. You see pictures of legislatures up here because we are now taking this to this state. So you got San Jose and San Francisco saying we're going to end this problem, and then the cities around them go, great, we're going to outlaw street sleeping, and it's all done. So the only way to solve this is at a state level, and California has half of the nation's unsheltered, so it is our problem. So we're working on legislation at the state that would require regions to at least assess what it would take to end unsheltered homelessness. Just do the math. We can't make you do it. Because when people do that and they look at it, that's it? $250 million? We spend $380 per year in San Francisco cleaning up after the problem. Like, the public needs to know that this is so solvable. It's a policy choice that we are sticking vehemently to our old definitions and not thinking with open minds. So our policy is going to require, there are two laws, one that would require regions to assess functional zero, and one that would require the state to plan to end unsheltered homelessness. God, it sounds so simple, you just think that was platitudes. To have the state say we are going to prioritize ending unsheltered homelessness is heresy. I'm not kidding you. Because we're letting go of those old assumptions of housing, and thank God it's starting to move through. We're so far unanimous. 3 years ago we tried this, and we didn't make it past the first committee. The housing advocates are furious. Furious, this is undignified. Well, there's not much dignity in a tent either. We're trying to change those policy and funding solutions so that all of the things, all of the views that want this anyway, we've got to change that intersection and bring policy and funding there. But in the meantime, it's been thrilling to see how much the private sector has come up. But that kind of goes back to my nonprofit, which is, I stand corrected. Philanthropy plays an important role in de-risking new solutions, but we need the capitalist system to scale. And that's what we're working on next. We're doing some innovations on funding approaches. These are relocatable, so they're not classified as real property in the tax code. They're personal property. 5-year accelerated bonus depreciation. 5 years. You get investors to put in the money. They get, if they're in the 50% tax bracket, half of it back in their first 2 years as depreciation losses. Then the city can lease it for a few years. Even the funding, if we think more creatively, then we innovate around why can't these be funded by private investors? Because investors aren't supposed to make money off of homelessness. If it solves it, I stand by that. So those are the types of innovations that we're doing. As she mentioned, we're just in the first couple of years of this, but today we have 500 rooms open and another 1,500 under development. And because people turn over on average about 8 months as they move on through to somewhere else, we've got the capacity already to serve 30,000 people in the next 10 years. That's the scale that's going to be necessary to truly end this problem. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion or questions.
Elizabeth.
Plus, it's a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're going to do a few questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That time was so sobering and at the same time so inspiring, really. And we've just doubled down on our personal commitments to solving these challenges with you. So we look forward to decades to come of working with you.
Hopefully not.
Well, no, continue
Hopefully
taking.
we can.
Well, there's so
solve.
many additional things, as you were saying, that we have to solve for. So we'll solve them in sequence and continue moving forward. We do have just a few minutes for some questions from the audience. We've got Elizabeth. She's going to be running out for an airplane very soon.
No, actually, I got talked into staying. I'm going to stick around.
Oh, you are? Fabulous. Well, there you go.
I grew up in Kansas. Country music's my thing.
Awesome. But we will take a few questions, and I see Jordan standing. If you have a question, please stand. It's the easiest way for us to find you. We've got mics out in the audience. But Jordan,
Thanks,
please.
Karen. Elizabeth, amazing, inspiring, and so impactful. My question, and I'm sure others here are probably thinking similar, we're from different places all around the world. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm thinking, why not here? And I'm sure other people are thinking, why not there or there? Have you had outreach from other places around the world or around the United States where they said, hey, help us understand your recipe and how we could do that here? And then how can we help bring that to our areas?
Thank you. I'd forgotten that I was supposed to have a call to action at the end. You guys need to help. So half of our nation's unsheltered is in California, so it's a pretty big market. But that said, this is a problem nationally and globally. So we're ready to expand. We're thinking the way we would do that is finding local developers who know all the lay of the land, and we help them. So whatever that looks like, but we've talked to Denver and Vancouver and Seattle and Portland and all sorts of places, and I think we're ready to do that. But our organization, as nimble and amazing as we are, we can't solve this ourselves. So we've authored a playbook that is literally the how-to guide, open source. Here's the modular manufacturers and the pros and cons of each. Here's how you get around the fire sprinklers issue. Here's the how to talk to the neighbors. And I hope that others will pick it up. I think, on the East Coast, unfortunately, we already have shelter. And so talking them into upgrading their shelter system is a lot harder because the people don't see the difference so much. On the West Coast, when 76% of people experiencing homelessness are literally on the street, it's a lot easier to convince that this is an essential next step. So it's kind of like, I've already got a Motorola phone, sell me on an iPhone is a subtle difference, but from the streets, so there's a lot of demand on the West Coast, but we are absolutely open and we would love to have introductions to cities. First thing you do is find me a vacant piece of land. And not one that's for sale, what you know from your word of mouth. There's a developer who's pausing their development, they're not really admitting it, right? That it's not gonna break ground for a few years. From your networks, if you've got a decent piece of land, these guys do a nice little fit test and something pretty, and now we got something to go talk about with the elected officials in the departments. Once you've got a real spot, then everything opens up. And by the way, private landowners get their property taxes waived during the time it's used for this. So they've got a little incentive. It needs to be ideally paved, although we're working to solve that. You guys haven't quite figured that one out yet. We're working on it. Ideally paved, obviously needs to be where people already are. We can't put them out in the middle of nowhere. Needs to be access to public transportation and available for a minimum of 5 years, ideally. And if you've got those up your sleeve or you know who does, call me.
All right, wonderful, thank you. We have, it looks like another question out in the audience.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I think as we're trying to roll this out in our local markets or talk to our local leaderships, I know when we're talking with clients, stories are so helpful. Does the playbook you talked about, does it include stories about people who have gone through your system? Because I think that would be really impactful as we're trying to spread this around.
Great
Yes,
question.
absolutely, absolutely. And you're exactly right. Like we've forgotten the humanity of these people and the potential of them. When I walk around our communities, all I hear is, I used to be a. Well, you still are, right? But what does your resume say? Professional sleeping bag inhabitant for the last 10 years? It's hard to get people back into their grooves, but there's still a lot of human potential out there, especially if we catch it early. So we've got stories on both sides of that spectrum, and thanks for that suggestion. We'll make sure they're...
All right, we've got one last question. Andy, is that, oh no, who's?
Not Andy.
Oh, in the back, I see. Okay.
Is this
Great.
working? Oh, hi. Hi, I'm Veronica. I'm actually in California, and I joined to help us with our homeless crisis. I'm interested to know from the people who are looking at the traditional way of solving homelessness that are challenging you and saying, we don't want this undignified solution, and you're talking about how it can be a move. It's a move in the right direction, right? If you look at San Jose, for instance, where you said there were 2,500 beds needed, and the cost is $80,000 per year to keep them on the streets, but only $40,000 to keep them housed. If you were to, have you had conversations with policymakers about taking that delta, splitting it, and saying, okay, how about you say $20,000 goes into a fund? That would be $50 million a year that could be put toward housing, traditional housing.
Yes, and it's hard because that $80,000 is scattered in so many budgets. A lot of it is the hospital system. That's about half the medical system. It's about half of that. Hospitals are big donors. I'll say that. They've done that P&L. But the Department of Public Works savings, I mean, you can't securitize against future savings. So it's where I think this investment model makes a lot of sense, because it's sort of no money down, and then you start paying as a lease over time when you are starting to see those savings. But it's a challenge because that $80,000 is, you don't see it. People don't know it's there.
Yeah. All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth.
You're welcome.
Again,
It's my pleasure.
It is a pleasure and an honor to have you here.
Thank you for being such great partners.
Yeah.